They hadn't spoken a child's name in 25 years. But when 4 desperate children appeared at their ranch gate, begging for a family, Daniel and Maria Blackhorse would discover that some prayers are answered in the most unexpected ways, and that love can bloom even in the driest desert of the human heart. The red earth of New Mexico stretched endlessly in all directions from the Blackhorse Ranch, a sea of sagebrush and juniper trees, broken only by the distant purple shadows of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Daniel Blackhorse stood on his porch, in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the stars fade into the approaching sunrise, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. At 52, he moved with the careful precision of a man who had learned to fill his days with purpose, even when that purpose felt hollow. The wind carried the scent of coming winter across the high desert, mixing the smell of sage with something sharper, something that made the horses restless in their paddock. Inside their modest adobe house, Maria Blackhorse was already at her loom, her fingers working the traditional patterns her grandmother had taught her decades ago. The rhythmic sound of the shuttle moving back and forth had become the heartbeat of their home, a constant whisper that filled the silence where children's laughter should have been.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
At 49, Maria's hands remained steady and sure, even if her heart had grown tired of hoping. The pattern she worked today was called Paths Through Darkness, an intricate design that required absolute concentration. Her grandmother had always said that the most beautiful patterns emerged from the deepest pain, that suffering refined the soul like fire refined silver. 25 years. That's how long it had been since they'd buried their stillborn son. In the small cemetery behind their house, next to the graves of 3 other babies who had never drawn breath. 4 tiny headstones marked with Navajo prayers and Christian crosses, symbols of their desperate faith in both worlds. Daniel had carved each stone himself, his tears mixing with the dust as he chiseled names they would never call aloud. Joseph, Samuel, Little Hawk, and Michael. 4 sons who existed only in their parents' memories and in the space between heartbeats. The cemetery was surrounded by a low wall of river stones that Daniel had built with his own hands, each rock chosen and placed with the reverence of a man trying to create something beautiful from unbearable loss. The ranch had been Daniel's grandfather's, then his father's, and now his. 3 generations of Blackhorse men had raised cattle and horses on this land, their wives filling the adobe walls with children's voices and the smell of fry bread. But Daniel and Maria's house remained stubbornly quiet, their dinner table set for 2, their conversations limited to the weather, the cattle, and the endless practical details of running a ranch that felt too big for just 2 people. The house itself seemed to echo with emptiness, its thick adobe walls absorbing sound rather than reflecting it, creating pockets of silence that felt almost solid. Daniel finished his coffee and walked toward the barn, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. Winter was coming early this year, and he could smell snow in the air. The horses nickered softly as he entered, their breath creating small clouds in the cold morning air. He had 20 head now, mostly mustangs he'd gentled himself, their wild spirits tamed but never truly broken. Each horse had its own personality, its own quirks and preferences. There was Thunder, a black stallion with white markings who still shied at sudden movements. Desert Rose, a Palomino mare with eyes like amber who would come when called. Old Pete, a grizzled gelding who'd been with the ranch for 15 years and knew the routine better than most cowboys. Sometimes Daniel wondered if he understood horses better than people. Horses didn't ask questions about why some families were blessed with children while others remained empty. They lived in the present moment, concerned only with food, water, safety, and the companionship of their herd. There was wisdom in that simplicity, a peace that Daniel envied. He'd learned their language over the years, could read their moods in the set of their ears, the arch of their necks, the way they held their tails. When he worked with them, he felt connected to something larger than his own grief. In the house, Maria continued weaving, her fingers working automatically while her mind wandered to places she tried not to visit. The local mission school had closed 3 years ago, taking away her job as a teacher and the daily contact with children that had kept her heart from completely calcifying. She missed the sound of young voices stumbling over English words, the way their faces lit up when they finally understood a difficult concept, the trust in their eyes when they brought her their problems. The mission had served children from 3 different tribes as well as the Mexican and Anglo families scattered across the territory. It had been a place where cultures mixed and children learned to navigate between worlds. Teaching had given Maria a sense of purpose that extended beyond her own childlessness. She'd poured all her maternal instincts into her students, staying late to help struggling readers, bringing extra food for children who came to school hungry, sewing patches on torn clothes, and mending scraped knees with equal care. Some of the older children had called her Mama Maria, and though it had made her heart ache, it had also given her a reason to get up each morning. The pattern she was weaving today was called Storm Clouds Gathering, a traditional design that seemed appropriate for the weather Daniel had predicted. Dark wool interwoven with threads of silver and white, creating the illusion of movement across the fabric. Her grandmother had always said that weaving was like life. Individual threads meant nothing alone, but together they created something beautiful and strong. Maria had believed that once, but 25 years of empty cribs had taught her that some patterns were destined to remain incomplete. Still, she continued to weave because the alternative was to sit still with her thoughts. And that way lay madness. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the ranch yard. Daniel worked methodically through his morning chores, feeding the horses, checking the water troughs, mending a section of fence that the wind had damaged. Physical labor was his meditation, his prayer, his way of staying connected to the land that had sustained his family for generations. He spoke to the horses in a mixture of English and Navajo, his voice gentle and patient. They understood him better than most humans did, responding to the tone and cadence of his words rather than their meaning. The ranch encompassed nearly 2,000 acres of high desert, from the creek bottom, where the best grass grew, to the rocky mesas that provided shelter for the cattle in winter. Daniel knew every inch of it, every hidden spring, every game trail, every place where the wild horses came to drink. His grandfather had taught him to read the land like a book, to understand its rhythms and respect its limits. The old man had believed that the earth was sacred, that every living thing was connected in an intricate web of relationships that humans disturbed at their peril. By mid-morning, Maria had finished the section she'd been working on and stepped outside to hang laundry on the line. The wind whipped her long black hair, now streaked with silver, across her face. She paused to watch Daniel in the distance, his tall frame bent over a section of fence. After 27 years of marriage, she could read his moods in the set of his shoulders, the rhythm of his movements. Today he carried the weight of winter preparation and something deeper, a sadness that seemed heavier on certain days. She wondered if he dreamed about their lost children the way she did, if he woke sometimes in the night reaching for babies who would never be there. Their nearest neighbors, the Garcias, lived 8 miles away across a landscape that could be treacherous in bad weather. The small town of Esperanza was 12 miles to the south, barely more than a trading post, a church, and a handful of houses clustered around a dusty main street. The isolation that had once felt like peace now sometimes felt like exile. When they'd first married, they'd imagined their children playing in the yard while Maria tended her garden and Daniel trained horses. They'd planned to teach their sons the old ways alongside the new, to pass down the stories and traditions that connected them to their ancestors. Instead, the ranch had become a museum of might-have-beens. The small bedroom they'd prepared,
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
As a nursery remained closed, its windows shuttered. Its walls still painted the pale yellow that would have worked for either a boy or a girl. Maria had sewn curtains with tiny horses running across white fabric, and Daniel had carved a wooden rocking horse that sat gathering dust in the corner. Neither of them could bear to change their room, but neither could they bear to enter it. The door remained closed like a wound that refused to heal. The day stretched on with its familiar rhythm. Daniel rode out to check on the cattle grazing in the far pasture, finding them clustered near the window where the grass stayed green longer. The herd was smaller than it had been in previous years. Without children to inherit the ranch, maintaining a large operation seemed pointless. He was gradually selling off stock, keeping only what they needed to survive. The thought of the ranch dying with them was almost too painful to consider. Who would care for the land when they were gone? Who would remember the stories his grandfather had told, the ceremonies his father had performed at the changing of the seasons? As he rode, Daniel found himself thinking about the morning he'd realized Maria would never carry another child to term. The doctor in Santa Fe had used clinical terms to explain what Daniel's heart already knew. Too much sorrow, too much loss, too many tiny graves in the family cemetery. Maria's body had simply given up trying. That night, they'd held each other and wept for all the children who would never be, for all the dreams they would have to bury alongside their hopes. Maria spent the afternoon in her garden, harvesting the last of the winter squash and pulling up the bean plants that had finished producing. Her hands worked automatically while her mind drifted to memories of the children she'd taught at the mission school. There had been one little girl, Anna, who'd reminded her so much of herself at that age, serious, observant, eager to learn, but too shy to raise her hand. Maria had made special efforts to draw her out, and by the end of the school year, Anna had been reading at a level far above her age. Then the school had closed, and Maria never learned what became of her. The garden had been Maria's refuge during the worst years of their grief. Something about coaxing life from the earth, about nurturing seeds into full growth, had helped heal the places in her heart that felt barren. She grew traditional crops alongside newer varieties, the three sisters of corn, beans, and squash, that her grandmother had taught her to plant together, as well as tomatoes and chiles that had come north from Mexico with the Spanish settlers. The garden was a meeting place of cultures, just as she and Daniel were. As evening approached, they came together in the kitchen for their silent dinner ritual. Maria served venison stew with fry bread, the same meal she'd been making for decades. The venison came from deer Daniel had hunted in the mountains, following the same trails his father and grandfather had used. The fry bread was made from her grandmother's recipe, each piece shaped by hand and cooked in cast iron that was older than the territorial government. They ate without speaking, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the wind rattling the windows. Daniel helped clear the dishes afterward, their movements choreographed by years of practice. He washed while she dried, standing side by side at the sink, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed plates back and forth. These small moments of physical contact had become precious to them, brief connections in a life that often felt like parallel paths that never quite converged. Sometimes Daniel would let his hand linger on hers as she took a dish, and sometimes Maria would stand just a little closer than necessary, their shoulders touching as they worked. After dinner, they sat in the living room as they had every night for 25 years. Daniel in his leather chair by the window, reading week-old newspapers from Santa Fe. Maria on the couch with her mending, her needle flashing in the lamplight as she repaired tears in work shirts and patches on denim. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it wasn't peaceful either. It was the silence of two people who had learned to live with disappointment, so profound it had become part of their landscape. The newspapers brought news of a changing world beyond their isolated valley, railroads pushing across the continent, bringing both opportunity and disruption to places that had remained unchanged for generations. Wars and politics and social movements that seemed as distant as the moon. Sometimes Daniel wondered what their children would have made of this changing world, whether they would have stayed on the ranch or ventured out to seek their fortunes. In the growing cities of the territory, sometimes Daniel would look up from his paper and catch Maria staring out the window at nothing, her hands still, her face reflecting a longing so deep it made his chest ache. Sometimes Maria would glance over and see Daniel's eyes focused not on the words he was reading but on something far beyond the page, his jaw tight with the effort of not saying the words they'd both stopped saying years ago. Maybe next time, maybe if we try again, maybe if we pray harder. They'd learned that hope could be as cruel as despair, that some dreams were too dangerous to hold. The grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from Maria's parents, chimed 9 times. Soon they would go to bed, Daniel checking the doors and windows while Maria turned down the oil lamps. They would lie beside each other in their marriage bed, close enough to touch but separated by a chasm of shared grief that neither knew how to bridge. They would rise again tomorrow and repeat the same rituals, the same careful dance of two people who had learned to survive rather than live. But tonight felt different somehow. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, some change carried on the wind that had been blowing from the north all day. He'd learned to trust his instincts over the years, the way his grandfather had taught him to read the weather in the behavior of animals and the color of the sky. Tonight, the horses had been restless, and the cattle had clustered closer to the barn than usual. Even their old dog, Sage, had been pacing by the door, whining softly as if sensing something his humans couldn't perceive. Sage had been with them for 12 years, a blue heeler mix who'd wandered onto the ranch as a puppy and decided to stay. He was gray around the muzzle now, content to spend his days dozing in the sun, but tonight he couldn't seem to settle. He kept going to the door, then to the window, then back to the door, his tail low and his ears pricked forward as if listening for something just beyond the range of human hearing. Maria felt it too, though she couldn't have explained what it was. A tension in the air, a sense of anticipation that made her fingers clumsy on her mending. She found herself listening for sounds that weren't there, watching the shadows beyond the lamplight as if expecting someone to emerge from the darkness. It was foolish, she told herself. They lived alone by choice now, had been alone for so long that visitors were nothing but a memory. The last unexpected guest had been Father Miguel from the mission, 3 years ago, coming to tell them the school was closing. The mission had been more than just Maria's workplace. It had been their connection to the larger community, their link to the world beyond their isolated ranch. When it closed, they'd lost more than a source of income. They'd lost their reason to venture into town, their excuse to be around other people, their window into lives that included the sound of children's voices. The silence that followed had been so complete, it seemed to have weight and substance. The wind picked up as the night deepened, rattling the shutters and moaning through the eaves of the old house. Daniel banked the fire in the stove and checked the door one more time before heading to bed. As he turned the handle, he paused, his hand frozen on the metal. For just a moment, he could have sworn he heard something over the wind. Not the cry of a coyote or the hoot of an owl, but something else. Something that sounded almost like voices, young voices, calling from the darkness beyond their gate. "Did you hear that?" Maria's voice came from behind him, soft but urgent. Daniel strained his ears, but there was only the wind howling across the desert, carrying the scents of sage and distant snow. "Hear what?" "I thought I heard." She shook her head, her long hair catching the lamplight. "Nothing. Just the wind playing tricks." But as they climbed the stairs to their bedroom, both of them paused at the landing window that faced the front gate. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the ranch yard and the road that led to town. The gate stood open, as it always did. Daniel had stopped closing it years ago. There was no point when no one ever came. Beyond the gate, the road stretched empty into the night, a pale ribbon disappearing into darkness. In bed, sleep eluded them both. Daniel lay on his back, staring at the ceiling where shadows from the window created shifting patterns that reminded him of the clouds his grandmother had read like prophecies. Maria curled on her side, facing the window, her eyes fixed on the silver path of moonlight that fell across their bedroom floor. The wind continued its restless song, and somewhere in the distance, Sage barked once, sharp and urgent, then fell silent as if something had startled him into silence. Maria drifted finally into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of children's voices calling her name, their words carried on a wind that smelled of rain and distant places. In her dream, she walked toward the voices, her feet following a path she couldn't see, drawn by a need so powerful it felt like hunger. When she woke, her cheeks were wet with tears she couldn't remember shedding, and the eastern sky was beginning to pale with the approach of dawn. Daniel remained awake, listening to the night and the growing certainty that their long solitude was about to end. Something was coming toward them across the desert, something that would change everything they thought they knew about their lives. He could feel it in his bones, the way his grandfather had felt approaching storms days before the first clouds appeared on the horizon. The knowledge settled in his chest like a stone, heavy with possibility and fear. The knock came at sunrise. So soft Daniel almost mistook it for the wind rattling loose boards on the porch. He'd been awake for hours, standing at the kitchen window with his second cup of coffee, watching the eastern sky bleed from black to deep purple to rose gold. Maria was still asleep upstairs, exhausted from a night of restless dreams, and the house held that peculiar stillness that comes just before the world wakes up. Then he heard it again, 3 hesitant taps on the heavy wooden door, barely loud enough to carry through the thick adobe walls. Daniel set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, his hand steadier than his racing heart. In 25 years of living on this remote ranch, no one had ever knocked on their door at dawn. Visitors were rare enough during daylight hours, and unexpected guests were virtually unknown. The few people who had reason to visit always announced themselves with the sound of horses or wagon wheels long before they reached the house. But this morning, there had been no warning sounds, no dust cloud on the horizon, just those tentative knocks that seemed to emerge from the silence itself. He crossed the kitchen in his stocking feet, pausing at the door to listen. Nothing. Perhaps he'd imagined it after all, his mind conjuring sounds from the restless energy that had kept him awake. But then Sage whined softly from his bed by the stove, his grizzled head raised and his ears pricked forward in the direction of the front porch. The old dog's instincts were sharper than any human's, and his reaction confirmed what Daniel's rational mind wanted to deny. The knocking came again, more insistent now, and this time Daniel heard something that made his breath catch in his throat. A voice, high and young, speaking words he couldn't quite make out through the heavy door. He moved quickly then, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor, and lifted the heavy bar that secured the entrance. The door swung open on its leather hinges, and Daniel found himself staring at a sight that would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. 4 children stood on his porch in the pale morning light, their clothes dusty and torn, their faces streaked with dirt and exhaustion. The oldest was a boy of perhaps 14, tall for his age but thin as a fence post, his dark hair hanging in his eyes and his shoulders set with the rigid posture of someone trying to appear braver. Then he felt. Behind him stood a girl who might have been 11, her blonde hair braided but coming loose around her face, her blue eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. A younger boy, maybe 8 years old, pressed close to her side, his round face pale with fatigue and his clothes hanging loose on his small frame. And in the girl's arms, a tiny child no more than 4 years old, her thumb in her mouth and her dark eyes staring at Daniel with the solemn intensity of someone who had seen too much for her tender years. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Daniel felt as though he were looking at a vision, a dream made manifest in the growing daylight. The children seemed equally stunned, as if they hadn't quite believed anyone would actually answer their knock. The oldest boy's mouth opened and closed without sound, and Daniel could see him struggling to find words for whatever desperate need had brought them to this isolated place. "Please, sir," the boy finally managed, his voice cracking with exhaustion and emotion. "We've been walking all night. We saw your light from the road, and we thought maybe. We're looking for someone who might help us." His words tumbled out in a rush, as if he were afraid Daniel might close the door before he could finish speaking. "We don't have anywhere else to go, and the little ones are so tired, and we haven't eaten since yesterday morning, and I know we're strangers, but slow down." "Son," Daniel said gently, and the word son seemed to surprise them both. He hadn't called anyone son in more years than he cared to count, and the familiar endearment felt strange on his tongue. "Take a breath. You're safe here." He stepped back from the doorway, gesturing for them to enter. "Come inside where it's warm." The children hesitated for a moment, and Daniel could see the wariness in their eyes, the learned caution of young people who had been hurt before. But exhaustion and desperation won out over fear, and the older boy stepped across the threshold first, followed quickly by the others. They clustered together just inside the door, still holding each other's hands, their eyes darting around the kitchen as if memorizing possible escape routes. Daniel closed the door behind them and turned to study his unexpected guests more closely. Up close, their condition was even more heartbreaking than he'd first realized. Their clothes were patched and repatched, clean but worn thin from hard use and careful washing. The older boy's boots were held together with strips of leather, and the girl's dress had been let down at the hem so many times that the original fabric barely covered her knees. The youngest child wore no shoes at all, her small feet dirty and scratched from walking on rough ground. "My name is Daniel Blackhorse," he said quietly, crouching down so he wouldn't tower over them quite so intimidatingly. "This is my home, and you're welcome here. What are your names?" The older boy straightened his shoulders and took a step forward, clearly appointed as spokesman for the group. "I'm Jacob," he said, his voice stronger now that they were inside and safe. "This is my sister Sarah, and my brother Thomas, and little Rose. We single quotes double." He paused, swallowing hard. "We're looking for a family. Someone who might want us." The simple words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Looking for a family, how many? Nights had he and Maria lain awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering what it would be like to hear those words, to have children choose them instead of the other way around. He cleared his throat, trying to find his voice. "Where did you come from? Where are your parents?" Jacob's face clouded, and he glanced back at his siblings before answering. "Our ma died 3 months ago from the fever. We don't have a pa." "Not really. Ma said he went to California when Rose was born, looking for gold, but he never came back. After May died, the county was going to split us up, send us to different families who might take 1 or 2 of us, but not all 4. So we ran." The girl Sarah spoke up for the first time, her voice soft but determined. "We promised Ma we'd stay together. She made us swear on her Bible that we wouldn't let them separate us, no matter what happened." Her hand tightened protectively on little Rose's shoulder. "We've been traveling for 2 weeks, asking at farms and towns if anyone might want all 4 of us, but nobody wants that many children at once. Most folks can barely feed their own families." Thomas, the 8-year-old, piped up with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Some people were nice but said 4 was too many. Some people weren't nice at all. One man in Cimarron said we were probably thieves and ran us off his land with a shotgun." His lower lip trembled slightly at the memory, but he lifted his chin defiantly. "We're not thieves, we're good children. Ma taught us manners an hour." letters, and how to work hard. Little Rose had remained silent throughout this exchange, her thumb still in her mouth, her dark eyes moving from face to face, as if trying to understand the adult conversation swirling around her. But when Thomas mentioned their mother, she pulled her thumb out long enough to whisper, "Mama's with the angels now." The words were said with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child too young to fully grasp the permanence of death, and they broke Daniel's heart more completely than all the older children's explanations combined. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted the conversation, and Maria appeared in the kitchen doorway, her long hair loosely braided and her woolen shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She'd thrown on her clothes hastily when she heard voices below, and her face showed the confusion of someone awakened from deep sleep. But when she saw the 4 children huddled together in her kitchen, all traces of sleepiness vanished, replaced by an expression of wonder and concern that transformed her features. "Dear Lord," she breathed, her hand flying to her throat. "Daniel, who are these children? Where did they come from?" Her eyes took in their condition with the quick assessment of someone who had spent years caring for young people, noting the exhaustion, the hunger, the way they instinctively pressed closer together when faced with another stranger. "Maria, this is Jacob, Sarah, Thomas, and Rose," Daniel said, his voice carefully neutral despite the emotion churning in his chest. "They've been traveling for 2 weeks, looking for a family who might take them in. All 4 of them, together." He emphasized the last words, knowing Maria would understand their significance immediately. Maria's hand remained pressed to her throat, and Daniel could see her struggling to process this impossible development. For a moment, the kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the clock and the soft whisper of wind around the eaves. Then Maria seemed to shake herself back to the present, her maternal instincts overriding her shock. "You must be starving," she said, moving toward the pantry with sudden purpose. "And cold, too. Daniel, stoke up the fire while I get them something to eat. Children, sit down at the table. You're safe here." Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to managing groups of young people, and the children responded immediately, settling themselves around the rough wooden table that had been set for 2 people for longer than any of them had been alive as Maria bustled around the kitchen, pulling out flour and eggs and the leftover venison from last night's dinner. Daniel found himself studying the children's faces in the growing daylight. Jacob had the serious expression of someone who had been forced to grow up too fast, his eyes holding a wariness that spoke of too much responsibility carried by shoulders still too young for such burdens. Sarah watched Maria's movements with the hungry attention of a girl learning how to be a woman without her mother's guidance. Thomas sat very straight in his chair, obviously trying to mind his manners despite his exhaustion. And little Rose remained curled against Sarah's side, her thumb back in her mouth, her eyes beginning to droop with the promise of safety and warmth. "How long since you've eaten?" Maria asked as she began mixing batter for pancakes, her movements quick and efficient despite the tremor Daniel could see in her hands. "Jacob mentioned yesterday morning," Daniel replied when the boy seemed too overcome to answer. Maria's lips tightened, and she reached for the large cast-iron skillet that hung beside the stove. "Then we'll start with something substantial. Growing children can't survive on empty stomachs." The smell of cooking food soon filled the kitchen, and Daniel watched the children's faces transform as the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were inside, out of the wind and weather. They were warm, seated at a real table instead of huddled beside some lonely campfire. And a kind woman was preparing to feed them, asking nothing in return except their presence at her table. Thomas's stomach rumbled loudly enough for everyone to hear, and he blushed crimson with embarrassment. "That's the sound of a healthy appetite," Maria said with the first real smile Daniel had seen from her in months. "Nothing to be ashamed of. Jacob, could you help me carry these plates? Your brothers and sisters look ready to fall asleep in their chairs." The older boy jumped up immediately, eager to be useful. And Daniel noticed how carefully he handled the dishes, how automatically he checked to make sure the younger children were settled before sitting down himself. The meal that followed was unlike any the Black Horse Ranch had seen in 25 years. 4 children attacking plates of pancakes and eggs with the focused intensity of people who had learned not to take food for granted. Maria kept the plates full and the cups brimming with fresh milk from their cow, her face glowing with a satisfaction Daniel hadn't seen since her teaching days. She asked gentle questions between servings, drawing out bits of their story without making them feel interrogated. They had lived in a small farming community east of Santa Fe, where their mother had taken in washing and mending to support them after their father's abandonment. When the fever came through the territory that spring, it had taken their mother along with dozens of other adults, leaving behind a generation of orphan children that the overwhelmed territorial authorities struggled to place. Jacob had overheard the county officials discussing their fate. Sarah might find placement as a household helper with a family in town. The boys could perhaps be apprenticed to tradesmen, and little Rose would likely end up in an orphanage in Denver. That's when we decided to run, Sarah explained, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. We packed what we could carry and slipped away in the night. Jacob said if we could just find the right family, people who needed help on a farm or ranch, maybe they'd want all of us. Her eyes met Maria's across the table. We're not afraid of hard work. Ma taught us that idle hands are the devil's playground. Thomas nodded vigorously, syrup sticking to his chin. I can milk cows and gather eggs and chop kindling. Sarah can cook almost as good as Ma could, and she knows how to tend sick animals. Jacob can do anything a grown man can do, almost. And Rose is real good at not getting in the way. The little girl in question had fallen asleep against Sarah's shoulder, her small body finally surrendering to exhaustion now that her stomach was full and she felt safe. Maria reached across the table to smooth a strand of hair from Rose's forehead, her touch gentle as a whisper. She's exhausted, poor little thing. They all are. Daniel, we should make up beds for them so they can rest properly. Her words were practical, matter of fact, but Daniel could hear the deeper current running beneath them. These children needed more than a meal and a place to sleep. They needed what he and Maria had been aching to give for 25 years. As if reading his thoughts, Jacob straightened in his chair and fixed Daniel with a direct stare that was remarkable for its maturity. Mr. Blackhorse, I need to ask you something straight out, and I hope you won't think poorly of us for it. He swallowed hard, gathering his courage. Are you and Mrs. Blackhorse the kind of people who might consider keeping us? All 4 of us, permanent-like. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock and the soft sound of Rose's breathing. Daniel felt Maria's eyes on him, felt the weight of 4 young lives hanging on his answer, felt the ghost of his own lost children stirring in the shadowy corners of his heart. Jacob, he said slowly, choosing his words with infinite care, that's not a question I can answer right this minute. It's too important to decide quickly, and it affects too many people. He saw the boy's face begin to fall and held up a hand. But I can tell you this. You're welcome to stay here while we all figure out what comes next. You need time to rest and recover from your journey, and we need time to think about what's best for everyone involved. Sarah spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. We don't want to be a burden. If you let us stay, we'll work hard to earn our keep. We know how to take care of ourselves mostly. We just need somewhere safe to be together while we figure out our next step. The desperation beneath her brave words was heartbreaking, the sound of children trying to negotiate for their own survival. Maria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Enough talk of burdens and earning your keep, she said. Firmly, you're children, not hired hands. Your job right now is to eat and sleep and feel safe. Everything else can wait. She moved around the table to lift little Rose into her arms, the small girl stirring but not waking. Daniel helped me get them settled. That back bedroom hasn't been used in years, but it's clean and warm, the back bedroom. Daniel's throat tightened at the mention of it. Not the nursery they'd prepared for their own children, but another room, one that had always been intended for guests who never came. As they moved through the house, Maria carrying Rose and the other children following like ducklings behind their mother, Daniel found himself seeing his home through their eyes. The thick adobe walls that provided shelter from the desert winds, the handmade furniture that spoke of permanence and care, the sense of safety that came from being truly welcomed rather than merely tolerated. The children were asleep almost. Before their heads hit the pillows, exhaustion claiming them completely now that they were finally warm and fed and secure. Maria tucked quilts around each small form with the practiced movements of someone who had done this countless times in her dreams. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching her face in the lamplight, seeing an expression of profound contentment that he hadn't witnessed in decades. Later, as they sat in the kitchen over coffee while the children slept, the magnitude of what had happened began to sink in. 4 children had appeared at their door like an answer to prayers they'd stopped praying, bringing with them the possibility of everything they'd thought was lost forever. But along with that possibility came questions that would have to be answered, decisions that would change their lives irrevocably. "They can't stay," Daniel said quietly, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "We're too old, too set in our ways. What do we know about raising 4 children?" But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were lies born of fear rather than truth. Maria looked at him across the table, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "What do any of us know about raising children until we do it? They need a home, Daniel. They need people who will love them and keep them together. And we ... double quote." She paused, her voice catching. "We need them too. This house has been quiet for too long." Outside, the wind continued its eternal song across the desert, but inside the Black Horse Ranch, something had fundamentally shifted. 4 children slept peacefully in beds that had been empty for years, their presence already beginning to transform the carefully ordered silence that Daniel and Maria had built around their grief. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult decisions, and the need to confront fears they'd carried for a quarter century. But tonight, for the first time in longer than either could remember, their home was filled with the sound of children breathing. The children slept for 14 hours straight, their exhausted bodies finally surrendering to the safety they'd found within the thick adobe walls of the Black Horse Ranch. Daniel woke several times during the night to check on them, moving silently through the house like a guardian spirit, pausing at their doorway to listen to the sound of peaceful breathing that had been absent from his home for so long. Each time he returned to bed, Maria would stir and whisper, "Are they still there?" As if she feared they might vanish like a desert mirage, if not constantly watched. When the children finally emerged from their room the next afternoon, they were transformed. The hollow-eyed exhaustion had been replaced by the natural energy of youth, and their faces, now clean from the washing Maria had insisted upon before bed, revealed the true beauty that had been hidden beneath layers of dust and weariness. Jacob's dark hair fell in waves across his forehead, and his brown eyes held flecks of gold that caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows. Sarah moved with a grace that spoke of her mother's careful training, her blonde hair now properly braided and her blue dress, though patched, clean and pressed. Thomas bounced on the balls of his feet with barely contained energy, his round face bright with curiosity about this new place they'd found themselves in. And little Rose clung to Sarah's hand but no longer hid her face, her dark eyes taking in every detail of her surroundings, with the intense observation of a child learning to trust again. Maria had spent the morning in a frenzy of cooking, as if trying to make up for every meal the children had missed during their 2 weeks of wandering. The kitchen table groaned under the weight of fresh bread, scrambled eggs with cheese, thick slices of bacon, fried potatoes with onions, and a pot of oatmeal sweetened with honey from their own hives. The abundance was overwhelming after weeks of sparse meals and empty bellies. And Daniel watched the children's faces as they took in the feast spread before them. "Mrs. Blackhorse," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with wonder. "This is too much. We can't eat all this food." Her hands twisted in her lap, betraying the anxiety beneath her polite words. These children had learned not to expect generosity, had been taught by harsh experience that every kindness came with a price they might not be able to pay. "Nonsense," Maria replied briskly, filling their plates with portions that would have fed grown men. Growing children need proper nutrition, especially after what you've been through. And please, call me Maria. Mrs. Blackhorse makes me feel ancient. She bustled around the table, pouring fresh milk and adding extra butter to the bread. Her movements quick and sure, but her eyes bright with an emotion Daniel recognized as pure joy. As the children ate, Maria peppered them with gentle questions about their journey, their likes and dislikes, their hopes and fears. She had always possessed the teacher's gift for drawing information from reluctant subjects, and soon the kitchen was filled with the sound of young voices sharing stories. Daniel suspected they'd kept locked inside for weeks. Thomas described the family of prairie dogs they'd watched near Clayton, mimicking their chittering calls until even solemn little Rose giggled behind her hand. Sarah talked about the woman in Raton who had given them directions and a loaf of day-old bread, kindness from a stranger that had kept them going when despair threatened to overwhelm them. Jacob, initially reserved, gradually opened up about the responsibility he felt for his siblings, the weight of decisions no 14-year-old should have to make. "I keep thinking I should have done something different," he confessed, his fork pushing eggs around his plate without eating them. "Maybe if I'd been smarter about which roads to take, or better at explaining our situation to people, we might have found a home sooner. The little ones shouldn't have had to walk so far or sleep on the ground so many nights." His young face was etched with guilt that belonged on someone 3 times his age. Daniel cleared his throat, drawing Jacob's attention. "Son, you kept your family together through 2 weeks of hardship that would have broken many grown men. You found your way to safety across hundreds of miles of unfamiliar territory. Whatever mistakes you think you made, they're nothing compared to what you accomplished." The words seemed to lift a visible weight from the boy's shoulders, and Jacob straightened in his chair with something approaching pride. After breakfast, Maria suggested a tour of the ranch, partly to satisfy the children's obvious curiosity, and partly, Daniel suspected, to keep them occupied while she processed the magnitude of the changes their presence had brought to her carefully ordered world. They started in the barn, where Daniel's horses nickered greetings, and Thomas's eyes went wide with wonder at their size and beauty. The boy had clearly been around animals before, approaching the horses with the proper mixture of respect and confidence that spoke of good training. "Can I pet him?" Thomas asked, his small hand already reaching toward Thunder's velvet nose. At Daniel's nod, he stroked the big stallion's face with surprising gentleness, his touch sure and unafraid. "He's beautiful. I always said horses could tell if you were afraid of them, and they didn't like cowards much." Thunder waffled softly against Thomas's palm, and Daniel felt a stirring of something he'd thought was dead forever. The connection between boy and horse was immediate and profound, the kind of wordless communication that couldn't be taught or forced. Thomas seemed to understand instinctively how to move around the large animals, where to place his hands, how to read their moods in the set of their ears and the arch of their necks. When Daniel mentioned that the horses needed grooming, Thomas volunteered eagerly, accepting the curry comb with the reverence of someone being handed a sacred trust. Meanwhile, Sarah and Rose had gravitated toward the chicken coop, where Maria's prized hens scratched and pecked in their enclosure. Sarah moved among them with easy familiarity, gathering eggs with practiced efficiency, while Rose watched from a safe distance, her thumb back in her mouth, but her eyes bright with interest. "Ma kept chickens," Sarah explained to Maria. Sighed. They were the most economical livestock for folks without much land. These are beautiful birds. That red one there looks like she's got some Rhode Island red in her bloodline. Maria was impressed by the girl's knowledge, recognizing in Sarah the same practical intelligence she'd seen in her best students at the mission school. Here was a child who had been taught to observe and analyze, to find patterns and make connections, skills that would serve her well regardless of what path her life eventually took. As they worked together, Sarah peppered Maria with questions about the ranch, the land, the rhythms of life in this isolated place. Jacob had attached himself to Daniel, following the older man as he went about his afternoon chores with the intensity of someone desperate to prove his worth. The boy asked intelligent questions about the cattle, the water system that kept the ranch functioning, the seasonal patterns that governed life in the high desert. He absorbed information like dry earth soaking up rain, his quick mind cataloging details that might be useful later. "You run this whole operation by yourself?" Jacob asked as they checked the windmill that pumped water from the deep well. "All this land, all these animals?" There was something approaching awe in his voice, the admiration of a young man beginning to understand the scope of adult responsibilities. "Maria and I manage it together," Daniel corrected gently. "It's not as large as it once was, and we've simplified the operation over the years, but yes, we handle most of the work ourselves. It's a good life, if you don't mind the isolation and the physical demands." He paused, studying Jacob's eager face. "What kind of work did you do back home?" Jacob's expression grew serious. "Whatever needed doing. I helped our neighbor with his crops during planting and harvest. Chopped wood for the widow who lived down the road. Fixed things around our own place when they broke. Ma said idle. Hands were the devil's playground, so she kept us all busy." His voice caught slightly at the mention of his mother, but he pushed on. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Blackhorse. None of us are." As the afternoon wore on, Daniel found himself watching the children with growing amazement. They weren't just well-behaved. They were genuinely helpful, pitching in with tasks without being asked, showing initiative and good judgment that spoke of excellent training. Jacob had an intuitive understanding of how machines worked quickly, grasping the principles behind the windmill and the water system. Sarah demonstrated a natural affinity for domestic tasks, helping Maria with the laundry and showing little Rose how to feed the chickens without getting pecked. Thomas revealed an almost supernatural connection with the animals, gentling skittish horse with a touch and somehow communicating with the barn cats in their own mysterious language. But it was the way they cared for each other that truly impressed both Daniel and Maria. Jacob never made a move without checking on his siblings first, his protective instincts so ingrained they seemed automatic. Sarah anticipated Rose's needs before the little girl even expressed them, providing comfort and guidance with the skill of someone who had been forced to become a mother before her time. Thomas, despite his youth, showed remarkable sensitivity to the moods of his older siblings, offering hugs and silly jokes whenever the weight of their situation threatened to overwhelm them. As evening approached, the children began to show signs of the anxiety that Daniel had expected all day. Their temporary safety was wonderful, but it was still temporary, and the uncertainty of their future hung over them like a storm cloud. Jacob, in particular, seemed to grow more tense as the sun sank toward the western horizon, his eyes darting frequently toward the road that led away from the ranch during dinner. The conversation was more subdued than it had been at breakfast. The children ate with good appetite, but seemed preoccupied, lost in thoughts they were too young to be carrying. Finally, as Maria served apple pie made from fruit she'd preserved the previous fall, Sarah voiced what they were all thinking. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackhorse," she began formally, her blue eyes serious beyond her years, "we want you to know how grateful we are for your kindness. You've given us more than we had any right to expect, and we'll never forget it. But we know we can't stay here forever, and we're wondering." She trailed off, unable to finish the question that needed to be asked. "You're wondering what happens next," Daniel said gently, and all 4 children nodded in unison. He exchanged a long look with Maria, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her dark eyes. They had avoided this conversation all day, both of them knowing it was inevitable, but neither wanting to face the impossible decision it represented. "The truth is," Maria said slowly, "we don't know what happens next. What we do know is that you're welcome to stay here as long as you need to, while we all figure out what's best for everyone involved." Her words were carefully neutral, but Daniel could hear the longing beneath them, the desperate hope that they might not have to say goodbye to these children, who had brought such life to their quiet home. Jacob straightened in his chair, his jaw set with determination. "Ma'am, I need to tell you something, and I hope you won't think less of us for it. We've been to 17 different places in the last 2 weeks, asking if anyone might want all 4 of us. Most folks were kind enough, but they all said the same thing. 4 children is too many for anyone to take on, especially when money's tight and times are hard." His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. "The thing is, we made a promise to our ma before she died. We swore on her Bible that we'd stay together no matter what happened, that we wouldn't let the county split us up even if it meant living rough and going hungry." Thomas nodded vigorously, his small face fierce with determination. "We're a family," he declared. "Families don't get separated just because it's convenient for other people. Ma taught us that blood is thicker than water, and promises made to dying people are sacred." The adult word sounded strange coming from his young mouth, but the conviction behind them was unmistakable. Little Rose, who had been quietly eating her pie, suddenly spoke up in her small, clear voice. "I dreamed about this place," she said matter-of-factly. "Before we came here, I dreamed about a big house with thick walls and nice people who had sad eyes but kind hands. In my dream, there were horses and chickens and a lady who sang while she cooked." She looked directly at Maria. "You sing sometimes, don't you? When you think nobody's listening." Maria's hand flew to her throat, her eyes wide with surprise. She did indeed sing while she worked. Old Navajo lullabies her grandmother had taught her, but she hadn't realized anyone had noticed the fact that this child had somehow dreamed of their home before ever seeing it sent a chill down Daniel's spine, reminding him of his grandfather's stories about visions and prophetic dreams. "Sometimes I sing," Maria admitted softly. "It helps pass the time and keeps my hands steady when I'm working." She studied Rose's solemn little face. "What else did you see in your dream, sweetheart?" Rose considered the question with the seriousness of a judge. "I saw a man with gentle hands who knew how to fix broken things. And I saw children playing in a big yard with lots of room to run. And there was love there, lots of love, but it was sleeping like a seed waiting for spring." She paused, her dark eyes wise beyond her years. "Are we this spring, do you think?" The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock and the soft whisper of wind around the eaves. Daniel felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight bands of grief and fear that had constrained his heart for so long. This child, barely old enough to form complete sentences, had somehow seen into the very core of their existence, had recognized the love that lay dormant beneath their carefully constructed defenses. "Rose," he said quietly, "I think you might be the wisest person at this table." He looked around at the 4 young faces watching him expectantly, at Maria's tear-bright eyes, at the home that had been transformed by their presence. "Your mother raised you well, all of you. She taught you to honor your promises, to care for each other, to face hardship with courage and dignity. Those are precious gifts." Sarah leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Does that mean you might consider keeping us? All 4 of us permanently?" The hope in her voice was painful to hear, the desperate need of children who had been disappointed too many times to believe in happy endings. Daniel felt the weight of 4 young lives hanging on his answer, felt Maria's eyes boring into him, felt the ghost of his own lost children stirring in the shadows of his memory. The practical part of his mind cataloged all the reasons why this was impossible. They were too old, too set in their ways, too wounded by their own losses to risk caring so deeply again. But his heart, awakening from its long sleep, whispered, "A different truth, I think," he said slowly, choosing his words with infinite care, "that some decisions are too important to be made quickly. What I can tell you is this: you have a home here for as long as you want it. Whether that's days or weeks or years, you're welcome at the Black Horse Ranch. You're part of our family now, if you want to be." The transformation that swept across the children's faces was like watching the sun rise after the longest night. Jacob's shoulders sagged with relief as the crushing weight of responsibility finally began to lift. Sarah's eyes filled with tears of joy and disbelief. Thomas whooped with excitement, his chair scraping backward as he jumped up to hug Daniel with surprising strength. And little Rose simply smiled, the first completely unguarded expression Daniel had seen from her, as if her prophetic dream was finally coming true. Later that evening, as Daniel and Maria sat on their porch listening to the sound of children's laughter drifting from the house, they marveled at how completely their world had changed in less than 24 hours. The silence that had defined their existence for a quarter century had been replaced by the beautiful chaos of young voices, running feet, and the thousand small sounds that come with a house full of life. "Are we really doing this?" Maria asked softly, her hand finding Daniel's in the darkness. "Are we really going to raise 4 children at our age?" There was wonder in her voice, and fear, and a joy so deep it seemed to come from the very center of her being. Daniel squeezed her fingers gently, feeling the calluses from years of weaving, the strength that had carried her through decades of disappointment and loss. "I think," he said quietly, "that those children didn't find us by accident. I think they were meant to be here, just like we were meant to be here to receive them. Your grandmother would have said it was the will of the Creator, working through dreams and desperate prayers." Inside the house, they could hear Jacob helping Thomas with his letters, Sarah teaching Rose a clapping song, the comfortable domestic sounds of a family settling in for the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, practical questions about schooling and clothing, and the legal arrangements that would make their guardianship official. But tonight, for the first time in 25 years, the Black Horse Ranch was filled with the sound of children's prayers being whispered into the darkness, and 2 hearts that had thought themselves broken beyond repair, discovering that love, like the desert after rain, could bloom again in the most unexpected places. 3 weeks had passed since the children's arrival, and the Black Horse Ranch had transformed into something Daniel barely recognized. Where once there had been only the sound of wind through empty rooms, now there was constant motion and noise. Jacob's boots on the wooden floors as he helped with morning chores, Sarah's gentle humming as she worked alongside Maria in the kitchen, Thomas's excited chatter as he fed the chickens, and Rose's delighted squeals when the barn cats allowed her to pet them. The house felt alive in a way it hadn't since Daniel and Maria were newlyweds, dreaming of the family they would build together. Daniel had written to the territorial authorities in Santa Fe, beginning the legal process that would make their guardianship official. The paperwork was complex and would take months to complete, but the children seemed to settle more deeply into their new life with each passing day. Jacob had taken over many of the heavier ranch chores, working alongside Daniel with an enthusiasm that reminded the older man of his own youth. Sarah had become Maria's shadow in the kitchen and garden, learning traditional Navajo weaving techniques with surprising aptitude. Thomas had appointed himself chief caretaker of all the ranch animals, displaying an almost supernatural ability to communicate with creatures both domestic and wild. And little Rose, who had barely spoken when she first arrived, now chattered constantly, her vocabulary expanding daily as she absorbed the love and security that surrounded her. It was Sarah who first spotted the rider approaching from the east, a dark speck against the morning sky that gradually resolved into a man on horseback, traveling fast and with obvious purpose. She had been hanging laundry on the line behind the house when movement on the horizon caught her eye, and something about the rider's determined approach made her stomach clench with sudden fear. She dropped the wet shirt she'd been holding and ran toward the barn where Daniel was teaching Jacob how to shoe horses. "Mr. Blackhorse," she called, her voice tight with anxiety. "There's someone coming." A man on a horse, riding hard from the direction of town. She twisted her apron. In her hands, her blue eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from experience. "He's coming straight here, like he knows exactly where he's going." Daniel straightened from the horse's hoof he'd been examining, his weathered face growing serious. In all his years on the ranch, visitors had been rare, and those who came usually traveled slowly, taking their time on the rough desert roads. Someone riding hard with obvious destination meant official business, and official business rarely brought good news to families like theirs. Jacob appeared at Daniel's shoulder, his young face pale but determined. "Should I get Thomas and Rose inside?" he asked quietly. "Maybe keep them out of sight until we know what this is about." The boy's protective instincts had been honed by weeks of traveling, weeks of never knowing whether the next stranger they encountered would help them or turn them away. "Good thinking," Daniel replied, his voice calm despite the growing tension in his chest. "Sarah, help Jacob gather the little ones and take them to the back bedroom. Stay there until we call for you. And Jacob," he added as the boy turned to go, "if things go badly, if this man means trouble, take your siblings and head for the canyon. Behind a house. There's a cave about half a mile up the trail, well hidden and stocked with supplies. You know the one I showed you last week, the children scattered like startled quail, their natural wariness reasserting itself after weeks of growing security." Daniel watched them go with a heavy heart, remembering suddenly how precarious their situation really was. They were not legally his children yet, and if someone in authority decided that an aging Navajo couple was not suitable to raise 4 white children, there would be little he could do to stop them from being taken away. Maria emerged from the house, drawn by the unusual activity in the yard. She had flour on her hands from the bread she'd been kneading, and her face showed the same mixture of concern and protective determination that Daniel felt rising in his own chest. Together, they watched the approaching rider, trying to read, in his posture and pace, the nature of the business that brought him to their isolated home. The man who finally reined in his horse at their gate was not what Daniel had expected. Instead of a territorial official or county sheriff, he found himself facing a middle-aged stranger in a dusty black suit, his face weathered by sun and wind, but his bearing suggesting education and authority. He dismounted with the careful movements of someone who had been riding hard for hours, his eyes scanning the ranch buildings with the practiced assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating other people's property. "Good morning," the stranger called, approaching on foot with his hat in his hands. "I'm looking for Daniel and Maria Blackhorse. I'm told this is their ranch." His voice carried the neutral politeness of someone conducting official business, neither friendly nor hostile but professionally distant. "I'm Daniel Blackhorse," Daniel replied, stepping forward with Maria at his side. "This is my wife Maria. What can we do for you, Mr. ... He let the question hang in the air, waiting for the stranger to identify himself. "Jameson," the man replied, reaching into his coat pocket for a leather wallet. "William Jameson, Territorial Child Welfare Office. I'm here about the 4 children you've taken in. The Mitchell children, I believe they're called." He produced official-looking papers, his movements deliberate and formal. "There's been some concern about their placement, questions about whether the proper procedures were followed." Daniel felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. The Mitchell children. He hadn't even known the children's real surname until this moment, had simply accepted Jacob's explanation that their mother had different last names from their absent father. Now it seemed that oversight might cost them everything they'd begun to hope for. "The children came to us voluntarily," Maria said, her voice steady despite the fear Daniel could see in her dark eyes. "They were hungry and exhausted from weeks of traveling, looking for a family who would take them all together. We've fed them, clothed them, given them shelter and love." "What procedures are you referring to, Mr. Jameson?" Jameson consulted his papers with the methodical thoroughness of a bureaucrat. "According to our records, Jacob, Sarah, Thomas, and Rose Mitchell became wards of the territorial government upon the death of their mother 3 months ago. They were scheduled for placement with approved families in different counties, arrangements that would have ensured their proper care and education. Instead, they disappeared from the county orphanage in the middle of the night, causing considerable concern and expense as search parties were organized. They ran away because you were going to separate them," Daniel said firmly. "They made a promise to their dying mother that they would stay together as a family. What kind of system splits up siblings just because it's more convenient for the administrators?" His voice carried an edge of anger that surprised even him, the protective instincts of a father rising to defend children who had become his own. Jameson's expression didn't change, but Daniel caught a flicker of something that might have been sympathy in the man's eyes. "I understand your feelings, Mr. Blackhorse, and I don't disagree with them personally. But the law requires that orphan children be placed through proper channels, with families who have been investigated and approved by the territorial authorities. We can't simply allow children to wander the countryside until they find someone willing to take them in." "Why not?" Maria asked sharply. "If the someone they find is willing and able to care for them, if the children are happy and healthy and safe, what difference does it make how they got there?" Her hands were clenched at her sides, flour still dusting her fingers, and Daniel could see the fierce protectiveness that had been awakened by 3 weeks of mothering children who the children needed her. Jameson sighed, suddenly looking older and more tired than his years. "Mrs. Blackhorse, in an ideal world, love and good intentions would be enough. But I've seen too many cases where children were placed with people who seemed kind, but turned out to be unsuitable, sometimes dangerously so. The system exists to protect children, even when it seems heartless or bureaucratic. Have we seemed unsuitable to you?" Daniel asked quietly. "In the time you've been here, have you seen any sign that these children are anything other than loved and well cared for?" He gestured toward the ranch buildings, the neat gardens, the signs of prosperity and stability that surrounded them. "Have you heard them cry out in fear or pain? Have you seen evidence of neglect or abuse?" Before Jameson could answer, the sound of children's voices drifted from the direction of the house. Despite their instructions to stay hidden, curiosity and concern had apparently gotten the better of them, and Daniel could see 4 small faces peering around the corner of the building. Jacob held little Rose in his arms while Sarah and Thomas flanked them, all 4 children watching the adult conversation with the tense attention of young people who understood that their fate was being decided. Jameson noticed them too, and his official mask slipped slightly as he took in their appearance. These were not the raggedy, half-wild children he had expected to find based on the reports that had reached his office. Instead, he saw 4 young people who were clean, well-dressed, and obviously healthy. Their clothes, while clearly handmade, were of good quality and showed signs of careful mending and loving attention. More importantly, they stayed close together, but showed no signs of the fear or wariness that characterized children who had been mistreated. "Children," Jameson called gently, "would you come here, please? I'd like to speak with you for a few minutes." His voice had lost its official tone, becoming warmer and more human as he addressed the young people whose lives he held in his bureaucratic hands. Jacob exchanged a quick glance with Sarah, some wordless communication passing between them, before he nodded and led his siblings toward the adults. They moved as a unit, their hands linked, their faces serious but not afraid. When they reached the group, Jacob stepped slightly forward, assuming his familiar role as spokesman and protector. "Are you here to take us away?" he asked directly, his young voice steady despite the magnitude of the question. "Because if you are, you should. Know that we're happy here. Mr. and Mrs. Blackhorse have been kinder to us than we had any right to expect. And we don't want to go anywhere else." Jameson studied the boy's face, seeing in it a maturity that should have been heartbreaking, but somehow wasn't. Instead, he saw strength and dignity and a fierce loyalty that spoke of excellent upbringing despite the hardships these children had endured. "I'm here to make sure you're all right," he said honestly. "There were people worried about you when you disappeared. People who wanted to know that you were safe and being properly cared for. We're being more than properly cared for," Sarah spoke up, her blue eyes flashing with indignation. "We're being loved. Do you know how rare that is for children like us? We've been to 17 different places in the past few months, begging for someone to take all 4 of us together. Everyone said we were too many, too much trouble, too expensive to feed and clothe. The Blackhorses didn't just take us in. They made us part of their family." Thomas nodded vigorously, his small face fierce with determination. "They teach us things," he added. "Mr. Blackhorse is showing me how to train horses, and Mrs. Blackhorse is teaching Sarah how to weave. Jacob's learning about ranch management, and even little Rose has her own chickens to take care of. We're not just being fed and housed. We're being prepared for life." Little Rose, who had remained silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke up in her clear, small voice. "In my dreams, the sad people with kind hands became happy again because of the children who came to their house. Are you going to make them sad again by taking us away?" Her dark eyes fixed on Jameson with an intensity that made the grown man shift uncomfortably. Daniel watched Jameson's face as the children spoke, seeing the internal struggle between official duty and human compassion that was playing out behind the bureaucrat's eyes. This was clearly not what the man had expected to find when he rode out to investigate reports of irregularly placed orphans. Instead of a problematic situation requiring immediate intervention, he had discovered something that looked remarkably like a family. "Mr. Jameson," Maria said quietly, "you said you've seen cases where children were placed with unsuitable people. But surely you've also seen the damage done when bureaucratic procedures take precedence over human needs. These children have found their home, found their family. They've healed from the trauma of losing their mother and weeks of uncertainty. Is the paperwork really more important than their happiness?" Jameson was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from the children's faces to the ranch buildings around them, taking in the evidence of stability and prosperity and love that surrounded him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to come from years of wrestling with impossible decisions. "The territorial government requires that all child placements be formalized through proper legal channels," he said slowly. "However, the law also recognizes that the best interests of the children must be the primary consideration in any placement decision. What I see here suggests that these children are thriving in your care, Mr. and Mrs. Blackhorse." He paused, reaching into his saddlebags to withdraw a thick sheaf of papers. "I brought adoption papers with me, just in case the situation warranted it. If you're willing to undergo the standard background investigation and home evaluation, I see no reason why your guardianship of these children couldn't be made official and permanent." The silence that followed his words was broken only by the sound of wind through the sagebrush and the distant lowing of cattle. Then Rose broke free from Jacob's arms and ran to Jameson, throwing her small arms around his legs with the impulsive affection of a child who had just recognized a friend. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice muffled against his dusty trousers. "Thank you for letting us stay with our new mama and papa." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow, the simple acceptance of a 4-year-old child cutting through all the legal complications and bureaucratic concerns to the heart of what really mattered. As Jameson knelt to return Rose's hug, Daniel saw tears in the official's eyes, and he understood that this man, for all his talk of procedures and regulations, was fundamentally driven by the same desire to protect and nurture children that had motivated Daniel and Maria to open their home to 4 desperate young strangers. The system might be imperfect, but the people within it were trying to do what was right, even when the rules seemed to work against the very children they were meant to protect. The paperwork would take months to complete, Jameson explained, as he prepared to leave, but in the meantime, the children could remain at the Black Horse Ranch under official supervision. There would be periodic visits, interviews, and evaluations, but nothing that would disrupt the family life that had begun to flourish in this isolated corner of the New Mexico territory. As they watched the territorial official ride away, disappearing into the shimmering heat haze of the desert, Daniel felt Maria's hand slip into his. Around them, their children, because that's what they were now, returned to their interrupted activities with the resilience of youth. But something fundamental had changed in the last few hours. They were no longer just a collection of individuals who had found shelter together. They were officially on their way to becoming a legal family, recognized and protected by the very system that had initially threatened to tear them apart that night. As Daniel and Maria sat on their porch listening to the familiar sound of children's bedtime prayers drifting through the open windows, they marveled at how completely their world had changed in just over 3 weeks. The fear that had gripped them when Jameson first rode up their drive had been replaced by a deep sense of gratitude and anticipation. Soon, very soon, their long years of loneliness would be officially over, and the Black Horse Ranch would finally be home to the family. It had always been meant to shelter. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a ferocity that caught even Daniel by surprise. The first snow fell in late October, blanketing the high desert in a silence so profound it seemed to muffle even thoughts. But inside the Black Horse Ranch house, the season brought a different kind of magic. For the first time in 25 years, the thick adobe walls echoed with the sounds of a family preparing for the holidays together. Maria teaching Sarah how to grind corn for traditional Navajo wedding cake. Jacob and Daniel crafting wooden toys in the barn workshop. Thomas collecting pine cones for decorations, and little Rose practicing the Christmas song she'd learned from her mother. The legal paperwork was progressing smoothly, with Mr. Jameson's monthly visits becoming less formal and more friendly as he witnessed the children's continued growth and happiness. Jacob had shot up 3 inches since his arrival, his shoulders broadening with the hard work of ranch life and the security of knowing he no longer bore sole responsibility for his siblings' survival. Sarah had blossomed into a confident young woman, her natural grace enhanced by Maria's patient teaching of traditional skills and modern practicalities. Thomas had become the unofficial veterinarian of the ranch, displaying an almost supernatural ability to diagnose and treat ailments in both domestic animals and the wild creatures that wandered onto their property. And Rose had transformed from a silent, thumb-sucking toddler into a chattering 4-year-old whose vocabulary grew daily and whose imagination seemed to encompass entire worlds. It was during the first week of December that their hard-won peace was shattered by the arrival of 3 horsemen who rode onto the ranch property without invitation or announcement. Daniel spotted them first from the barn where he was helping Jacob repair a broken harness, their dark silhouettes stark against the white expanse of snow-covered desert. Something about their approach set his teeth on edge. They rode in formation like soldiers or lawmen, their horses moving with military precision, and they made no attempt to announce themselves or request permission to enter private property. Jacob, Daniel said quietly, not taking his eyes off the approaching riders, "Go to the house and tell Maria to gather the children in the back bedroom. Lock the door and don't come out until I call for you, no matter what you hear." His voice carried an urgency that made the boy's face go pale, but Jacob had learned to trust Daniel's instincts without question. The lead rider was a tall man, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes like chips of blue ice. He wore a badge pinned to his heavy wool coat, and the way he sat his horse suggested military training. Behind him rode two younger men, both armed with rifles that they carried with casual familiarity. When they reined in their horses near the porch, the lead man didn't dismount immediately, instead taking time to survey the ranch buildings with the calculating gaze of someone assessing potential threats. "You Daniel Blackhorse?" he called, his voice carrying easily across the snow-muffled yard. There was something in his tone that put Daniel immediately on guard, a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter weather. "I am," Daniel replied, stepping out of the barn with deliberate slowness, keeping his hands visible and his movements non-threatening. Years of living as a Native American in territorial New Mexico had taught him to be careful around armed white men, especially those who wore badges. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" The man finally dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached. "I'm Marshal Wade Carson, Territorial Enforcement Division. These are my deputies, Hawkins and Morrow. We're here about the children you've taken in, the Mitchell children." He reached into his coat for official papers, his movements sharp and militaristic. "There've been complaints filed, questions raised about the suitability of this placement." Daniel felt his heart sink even as his protective instincts flared to life. After months of progress and growing security, it seemed their family was once again under threat from bureaucratic interference. "What kind of complaints?" he asked carefully. "Mr. Jameson from the Territorial Child Welfare Office has been conducting regular inspections. He's found nothing objectionable about our care of the children." Carson's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Jameson's what you might call the soft side of Territorial Child Services. Some folks higher up the chain of command aren't satisfied with his reports, think maybe he's gone native, if you catch my meaning. They sent us to conduct a more thorough evaluation." His eyes swept over Daniel with undisguised contempt. "See, there are people in Santa Fe who think it's unnatural for Indian folk to be raising white children. Questions about whether you people have the proper moral fiber for such responsibility." The racism in Carson's words hit Daniel like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain calm. Losing his temper would only provide these men with the excuse they were obviously looking for. "The children came to us voluntarily," he said quietly. "They were starving and desperate, and we took them in. They've thrived in our care, grown healthy and strong and happy. What more evaluation do you need than that?" "That's for us to determine." Deputy Hawkins spoke up, his hand resting casually on his rifle stock. "We'll need to interview the children separately, inspect the living conditions, review your financial records. Make sure these kids are being raised proper, with Christian values and American ideals." His implication was clear. Native American values were somehow insufficient for raising territorial children. From the house came the sound of a door slamming, and Maria appeared on the porch, her face set with the kind of fierce determination Daniel had learned to both admire and fear. She had obviously been listening from inside, and her dark eyes blazed with an anger that made the temperature seem to drop another 10 degrees. "Those children have been raised with love, respect, and dignity," she said, her voice carrying across the yard with crystalline clarity. "They've learned traditional skills alongside modern ones, been taught to honor both their heritage and their adopted culture. If that's not Christian enough or American enough for you, then your standards say more about you than about us." She descended the porch steps with regal bearing, every inch the teacher and protector she had always been. Carson's expression hardened at Maria's defiance. "Ma'am, I'd advise you to watch your tone. We're here on official business, and obstruction of a territorial investigation is a serious crime. Now we need to see those children, and we need to see them now." "The children are my concern," Daniel said firmly, moving to place himself between Carson and Maria. "If you want to speak with them, you'll do it in my presence, with respect and courtesy." They've been through enough trauma in their young lives without being subjected to hostile interrogation by strangers. Deputy Morrow shifted in his saddle, his rifle moving to a more accessible position. Blackhorse, you're in no position to make demands. Either you cooperate with this investigation, or we'll arrest you for obstruction and take the children into territorial custody, pending a full review. Your choice. The threat hung in the cold air, like smoke from a gunshot. Daniel felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with situations where his race made him automatically suspect, where his word would carry no weight against that of white officials. But this time was different. This time he wasn't alone. And he had 4 children depending on him to stand firm against injustice. Before he could respond, the sound of footsteps in snow made everyone turn toward the barn. Jacob emerged from the building, his young face set with determination that made him look far older than his 14 years. Behind him came Sarah, Thomas, and little Rose, all of them moving with the quiet dignity that had characterized their behavior since the day they'd arrived at the ranch. "Mr. Blackhorse told us to stay inside," Jacob said clearly, his voice carrying across the snowy yard. "But we heard raised voices, and we thought you might need us." He looked directly at Marshal Carson, showing no trace of the fear or deference the man obviously expected from children. "Are you here to take us away from our family?" Carson studied the 4 young people with calculating eyes, taking in their clean clothes, healthy appearance, and obvious education. These were not the neglected, half-wild children he had been led to expect, and Daniel could see him recalibrating his approach in real time. "Children," Carson said, his voice taking on what he probably thought was a kindly tone. "We're here because there are concerns about your welfare. Some people think you might be better off with families of your own. People who can give you proper guidance and education." His words dripped with condescension, the assumption that Native American culture was somehow inferior to white civilization. Sarah stepped forward, her blue eyes flashing with indignation that reminded Daniel powerfully of her mother's protective spirit. "Marshal Carson, with all due respect, you're speaking about things you don't understand. The Blackhorses haven't just taken us in. They've made us part of their family. We've learned more in the past few months than we did in years of irregular schooling. We're healthy, happy, and loved. What more could any children want?" "You're young," Deputy Hawkins said condescendingly. "You don't understand the importance of being raised in a proper Christian household, learning American values from American people. These Indians might seem nice enough, but they're not equipped to prepare you for life in civilized society." Thomas, who had been listening with growing anger, suddenly burst out with the passionate conviction of an 8-year-old who had found his voice. "Mr. Blackhorse is the most civilized person I've ever met. He's patient and kind and wise, and he knows more about honor and honesty than any grown-up I knew before. Mrs. Blackhorse teaches us every day about respect and hard work and taking care of each other. If that's not American values, then I don't know what is." Little Rose, who had been clutching Sarah's hand and watching the adults with wide eyes, suddenly spoke up in her clear, piping voice. "Are you bad men?" she asked with the direct honesty of childhood. "Because you're making my mama and papa scared. And people who make families scared are usually bad men." The innocence of her question and the complete naturalness with which she referred to Daniel and Maria as her parents seemed to strike Carson like a physical blow. For a moment, his official mask slipped, revealing something that might have been uncertainty or even shame. But it was quickly replaced by renewed determination. "It doesn't matter what these children think they want," he said harshly. "The law is clear. White children belong with white families, where they can be raised with proper values and expectations. The territorial government has identified suitable placements for all 4 of them, good Christian homes where they'll receive appropriate guidance. Separate homes," Jacob said quietly, and it wasn't a question. "You're going to split us up, just like the county tried to do after Maya died. You're going to break the promise we made to her on her deathbed." His voice carried a weight of resignation that was heartbreaking in someone so young. Sometimes families have to be separated for the greater good, Deputy Morrow said with bureaucratic coldness. "You'll understand when you're older that adults know what's best for children, even when the children don't agree." Maria had heard enough. She stepped forward with the regal bearing of someone who had descended from chiefs and medicine men, her dark eyes blazing with a fury that made even the armed deputies take an involuntary step backward. "These children made a sacred promise to their dying mother," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "In my culture, and in theirs, such promises are binding until death. You talk about Christian values while preparing to destroy a family that has found healing and wholeness together. What kind of Christianity is that?" Carson's face flushed with anger at being challenged by a Native American woman, especially one who showed no deference to his authority. "Ma'am, you're out of line. This is official territorial business, and your opinions don't factor into our decision-making process. These children will be removed from this household today, and any interference will result in arrest and prosecution." "Then you'll have to arrest me too," came a new voice from the direction of the road, and everyone turned to see a familiar figure approaching on horseback. Mr. Jameson rode into the yard with the deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly what he was walking into, his weathered face set with determination. Behind him rode Sheriff Martinez from the county seat, a man Daniel knew by reputation as someone who dealt fairly with all the citizens under his jurisdiction. Carson's expression darkened at the sight of the two men. "Jameson, what are you doing here? This matter has been taken out of your hands by higher authorities." Jameson dismounted calmly, brushing snow from his coat as he approached the group. "Marshal Carson, I received word of your intended action here today, and I felt it necessary to remind you of certain legal facts you may have overlooked." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a thick folder of papers. "The Blackhorse family's adoption petition has been approved at every level of territorial administration. These children are legally their wards under the protection of territorial law. Any attempt to remove them without just cause would constitute kidnapping under Territorial Statute 247. The silence that followed was broken only by the whisper of wind through the bare cottonwood trees and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the barn. Carson's face had gone pale beneath his beard, and Daniel could see him frantically recalculating the situation. Sheriff Martinez rode closer, his hand resting casually on his sidearm, his message clear without words. "Furthermore," Jameson continued, his voice gaining strength, "I have affidavits from 3 territorial judges stating that the placement of the Mitchell children with the Blackhorse family represents the ideal outcome for orphaned children. A loving home where siblings can remain together, adequate financial resources, moral guidance, and educational opportunities. Any challenge to this placement would require extraordinary evidence of abuse or neglect, evidence which I'm confident doesn't exist." Rose broke free from Sarah's grip and ran to Jameson, throwing her small arms around his legs with the same impulsive affection she had shown during his first visit. "Mr. Jameson," she cried joyfully, "did you come to make sure we can stay with our mama and papa?" Her complete trust and obvious happiness in the presence of the child welfare officer provided more testimony than any legal document could have offered. Carson looked from the affectionate child to the official papers in Jameson's hands to the determined faces of the family he had come to destroy. Whatever pressure had been brought to bear on him from Santa Fe, it was clear that this particular battle was lost. But his expression promised that the war was far from over. "This isn't finished," he said grimly, gesturing for his deputies to mount up. "There are people in the territorial capital who won't be satisfied with this outcome. People who believe in maintaining proper social order. You may have won this round, Blackhorse, but don't think you're safe. We'll be watching, and the first sign of trouble, The first hint that these children aren't being raised according to American standards. We'll be back as the three men rode away, disappearing into the swirling snow that had begun to fall. More heavily, Daniel felt Maria's hand slip into his. Around them, their children, because that's what they truly were now, pressed close for comfort and reassurance. The threat was past for the moment, but everyone understood that their happiness remained fragile, subject to the prejudices and politics of people who would never understand what they had built together. That night, as the family gathered around their fireplace for evening prayers, Daniel looked at each beloved face illuminated by the dancing flames and felt a fierce protectiveness rise in his chest. They had survived another challenge, passed another test, but he knew that their greatest trials might still lie ahead. Love, it seemed, was not always enough to overcome the hatred and fear that some people carried in their hearts. But it was all they had, and it would have to be enough. 5 years later, the Black Horse Ranch had become something Daniel and Maria never dared imagine during their decades of silence. The final adoption papers had been signed on a crisp spring morning, making all 4 children officially black horses in the eyes of both territorial law and their own hearts. The threats from Marshall Carson had faded into memory, replaced by the rich tapestry of daily life that defines a true family. Jacob, now 19, had grown into a man who could manage the ranch with skill that impressed neighboring ranchers. His shoulders had broadened from years of hard work, and his quiet wisdom came from learning responsibility early while never losing his capacity for joy. Sarah, at 16, had become a young woman whose Navajo blankets were sought after by traders from as far as Denver. She balanced her weaving with managing the ranch's books, her quick mind for numbers proving invaluable as their operation expanded. Thomas, 13 and tall for his age, had fulfilled his early promise with animals. He could gentle the wildest Mustang with patience that seemed almost mystical, and ranchers throughout the territory brought their most difficult horses to him. His gift extended to all creatures, making the ranch an unofficial sanctuary for injured wildlife. Rose, 9 years old and no longer the silent child who had arrived at their door, spent hours at the small desk Daniel had built her, writing stories about desert animals with the wonder of someone who never took happiness for granted. The ranch itself had prospered beyond Daniel's dreams. Their horse breeding program had become one of the territory's most successful, with the Black Horse brand synonymous with quality and integrity. More importantly, the ranch had become a gathering place for the scattered community, hosting celebrations that brought together families from hundreds of miles around. It was during Jacob's 19th birthday celebration that Daniel found himself on the porch with Maria, watching their children dance with friends in the yard full of wagons and horses. The air was filled with music and laughter as Navajo, Mexican, and Anglo families celebrated together in the way that had become natural in their corner of the territory. "Do you remember when we thought our story was over?" Maria asked softly, her hand finding his in the familiar gesture that had anchored them through decades of marriage. "When we believed the silence would be all we'd ever have." Her voice carried wonder rather than sadness, the amazement of someone looking back on a miracle that had unfolded slowly over years. Daniel squeezed her fingers gently, watching Rose chase fireflies while Thomas played guitar for a circle of children. "I remember thinking that God had forgotten us, that we'd used up all our chances for happiness." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wrong about so many things. The years had brought challenges, droughts when water became precious as gold, winters when snow piled higher than windows, illnesses that tested their faith. Jacob had broken his arm badly at 16. Sarah had struggled at 14 with being different from other families. Thomas had been thrown by a stallion and unconscious for 3 terrifying days. Rose had contracted pneumonia at 7, and Daniel had spent sleepless nights praying by her bedside. But they had weathered each storm together, their bonds growing stronger under pressure. The children had learned that family meant choosing each day to stand together against whatever challenges the world might bring. They had seen their parents face prejudice and harassment with dignity, learning that love backed by courage was the most powerful force in the world. As evening wound down and guests hitched their wagons for home, Daniel found himself surrounded by his children in the way that had become traditional. Jacob stood tall and proud, his arm around Sarah's shoulders in his unchanged protective gesture. Thomas sat cross-legged with his guitar while Rose curled against Maria's side like a contented kitten. "Papa," Rose said suddenly, using the name that never failed to make Daniel's heart skip, "tell us again about the morning we came to your door. Tell us how we were scared and hungry, and how you and Mama made us feel safe." It was a story she never tired of hearing about how their family began. Daniel looked at these faces more precious to him than his own life, these children who had taught him that healing was possible and love could bloom in unexpected places. It was a morning like many others, he began with storyteller's cadence. Your mama was at her loom, and I was drinking cold coffee watching the sunrise. We knew what our day would bring. We had no idea that 4 angels were walking across the desert toward us, carrying gifts we didn't know we needed. As he spoke, Daniel felt the truth settling around them like a benediction. These children had indeed been angels, messengers of hope who arrived when hope seemed lost forever. They brought not just their need for love and shelter, but keys to unlock hearts closed too long, courage to believe in second chances, and wisdom that families are sometimes chosen rather than born. The stars emerged in the vast New Mexico sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first steps toward becoming a family. Inside the ranch house, lamps glowed in windows that had been dark for too long, testament that some lights, once kindled, can never be extinguished. Daniel listened to his children's breathing, wind through sagebrush, distant cattle settling for the night, and knew he was the richest man in the territory, not because of land or horses or money, but because 4 desperate children had knocked on his door one dawn morning and transformed his house into a home, his silence into song, his ending into a glorious new beginning.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.